You're wide awake again, staring at the ceiling. Your brain won't stop narrating every mistake you made in 2007, and your pillow feels like it's plotting against you. Meanwhile, somewhere in the dusty pages of history, a man named Saladin is fast asleep. On the ground in a tent, one sword's length away from an invading army, and not just napping sleeping, deeply peacefully. Like someone who's never once doom-scrolled past midnight, or stared at the blue light of their sins. This isn't fiction. This is history. Real history. A man who ruled empires, negotiated with kings, faced off with crusaders, and still managed to hit REM faster than you do after 3 melatonin gummies and a bedtime podcast called Gentle Rain and Tax Fraud. Saladin didn't need blackout curtains. He had clarity, purpose, and a mat. Just a mat. So tonight we're not counting sheep. We're counting moments of medieval composure. We're crawling into the woven blanket of the 12th century and asking a very modern question. What did he know that we don't? No drama, no noise. Just a softly crackling fire, the flap of a tent, and a man in full command of sleep. Welcome to Saladin's bedtime. Let's begin. The man, the myth, the surprisingly well-rested Sultan Saladin was many things: a warrior, a leader, a political tightrope walker in a world where everyone carried a sword and a grudge. But what most people forget is this: the man knew how to sleep. Not the restless kind where you toss around wondering if you locked the door. Saladin slept like he knew exactly what time the sun was rising and had already forgiven it for being late. Born in 1137 in Tikrit, in what's now Iraq, Saladin wasn't raised to be a conqueror. He wasn't even the oldest son. His childhood didn't scream future legend. He studied religion, read philosophy, probably kicked pebbles down dusty roads, wondering if he'd ever be more than a military administrator's nephew. But something about him shifted as he grew. Quiet resolve turned into steel. Strategy bloomed in silence. And through it all, one thing never changed: his uncanny ability to rest in the eye of every storm. He didn't lounge in silk-draped rooms or soak in marble tubs. His bed was often a rolled-up mat beside a weapon rack, and his pillow was usually his cloak. Yet he slept with the serenity of a monk on holiday. Between battles he napped. Before negotiations he breathed deep and let sleep find him. In a world filled with noise, Saladin mastered the art of stillness. People underestimated that stillness. They thought he was soft. They mistook calm for weakness. Then he defeated the Crusaders, reclaimed Jerusalem, and made peace look more powerful than war. And somehow, even in those high-tension moments, when kings argued, knights sharpened blades, and religious fury burned through the Holy Land, Saladin was known to rest his eyes. His generals would find him under the stars, arms crossed, face relaxed, breathing steady. A commander with thousands of lives under his care, dreaming while others paced and panicked. He didn't fear the dark. He welcomed it. He didn't dread sleep. He invited it, because unlike most of us, he wasn't dragging unfinished tasks and open browser tabs into bed with him. He made decisions during the day, honored them at dusk, and surrendered to rest as if it were a spiritual practice. Saladin's life was not quiet, but his sleep was. And that's what made it remarkable. He led with discipline and restraint. He ruled not from a throne of comfort, but from a heart trained in balance. And when the world spun too fast, when the politics got tangled, when armies drew near, he chose rest over reaction. So if you think sleep is for the lazy, or that leaders must be sleepless martyrs pacing palace halls in candlelight, think again. Saladin didn't burn out. He burned steadily, and he did it one whole night of sleep at a time. Childhood in Tikrit, where babies were born with swords, and stress Saladin didn't come into the world quietly. He was born in a fortress. not a hospital, not a village. A literal fortress in the middle of a political relocation so awkward that his father got kicked out of town the same night. His first lullaby was probably someone yelling about alliances while sharpening a dagger. And yet, somehow, baby Saladin slept through the chaos. Through the arguing, through the sound of clanging metal and unspoken tension. It's like his bones already knew how to ignore noise and find stillness. Growing up in Tikrit meant learning how to stay alert without looking anxious. It meant knowing which direction was east, where the doors were, and who was most likely to draw a blade if negotiations went wrong. And still, he rested. Maybe it was defiance. Perhaps it was wisdom. His nervous system was built differently, but while the grown men whispered and plotted into the night, the boy with the dark eyes and quiet soul closed his eyes and drifted into sleep like it was the safest thing in the world. His childhood wasn't padded. There were no soft toys or bedtime stories with happy endings. He studied. He trained. He watched. He learned early on that trust was rare and peace even rarer. But where other boys grew jittery and sharp-eyed, Saladin somehow found a rhythm. He didn't panic. He paced himself. And when night came, he didn't stare at the ceiling, counting shadows. He slept deeply, not because his world was calm, but because he chose not to carry it into his dreams. By the time he was a teenager, he had already moved through more cities and military camps than most men would in a lifetime. Each new place meant new threats, new names to remember, new alliances to tiptoe around. His bed was never the same twice. Sometimes it was a mat in a dust, sometimes it was the ground beside his uncle's horse. But his breath always found its rhythm. His eyes were always closed. His body always surrendered to rest, as if it trusted the night more than the noise. That was his secret. Everyone thought the strength came later, with the titles and the victories. But it didn't. It came from Tikrit, from watching chaos unfold, and refusing to let it take root in him, from being the child who slept while others schemed, from knowing that one day the quiet boy in the background would rise, not with loud declarations or flashy armor, but with the unshakable stillness of someone who had nothing left to prove. And while no one saw it then, that quiet sleep was the beginning of his rule. Because the boy who could sleep in a fortress built for war would grow into the man who slept on battlefields, trusting that peace, real peace, starts when you stop letting fear control your breath. Life in the castle, stone walls, cold floors, and a surprisingly comfy mat. He didn't grow up in a palace of gold. No silk sheets, no harp lullabies. Saladin's childhood castle was a box of stone and echo, the kind of place where your footsteps followed you for 5 seconds after you stopped walking. Cold walls, colder floors, windows so small that they barely noticed the sun. And yet, in that echoing box of shadows and hard edges, Saladin found sleep. Not just the shallow kind that dances at the edge of dreams. The real kind. The kind that sinks you so deep, it takes a rooster or a trumpet or a well-aimed sandal to pull you back. He slept beside weapons. That was the furniture. A mat near a wall, a few scrolls, a sword, a set of armor that belonged to someone who hadn't made it back last winter. But he didn't flinch. He didn't startle at creaks or whispers. The night didn't frighten him. He knew the cold was part of the room. He knew the silence meant you were safe enough to close your eyes without asking who was still awake. The other boys in the fortress paced. They peeked through arrow slits. They stayed up whispering about rumors and what the generals might do next. But Saladin just lay down and breathed. That was the twist. He didn't need to be older, stronger, or more prosperous. He just needed to be still. While the world practiced noise, he practiced quiet. While others chased approval, he learned the value of peace, that no one could see. It wasn't about comfort. He didn't need fluff. His pillow was a rolled cloak. His blanket smelled like dust and time. But when he lay down, he disappeared. His thoughts didn't circle. His breath didn't race. His spine softened into the mat like it had been waiting all day to return. It's strange how a warrior's instincts can live beside a monk's calm. But that was Saladin, the boy who watched blades sharpened and learned how to let go. Some nights were loud, trumpets, visitors, news from the frontier. His uncle barking orders before dawn. But Saladin kept sleeping. His dreams didn't panic. He didn't leap up sword in hand unless he had to. And even then, he looked like someone who had been resting 5 minutes before a storm just to see how well his heart could slow down. That's what confuses people. They thought warriors were built on tension, on raw nerves and sleepless eyes. But he was built differently, not on rage or urgency, on rhythm, on knowing that no matter how high the walls or heavy the silence, peace was something you carried with you, something you unrolled each night like a mat in the corner of a cold stone room. And while others wore themselves thin trying to impress or predict the world, Saladin slept. Not because the world was easy, but because his soul had already decided not to panic. The secret of the siesta, Saladin's afternoon reset ritual, the castle taught him how to sleep through echoes. The campaigns would teach him how to nap through noise. It didn't matter if the ground was trembling under marching feet, or if someone was reciting a treaty too loudly by the fire. Saladin believed in rest the way most men believed in strategy. It wasn't optional, it was essential. He didn't wait until night, when the sun was high and the heat sat heavy on your shoulders like armor you couldn't take off. Saladin vanished. Not from the battlefield, from the hour. He'd sit quietly in the shade, pull his cloak around him like it had something to say, and fall asleep for 20 minutes, like the fate of the world wasn't tapping its foot nearby. People assumed it was a luxury, a sign that he didn't care, but they misunderstood the ritual. That short silence in the middle of the day was how he reset. A controlled surrender, a pause sharp enough to cut through tension, while others dragged their exhaustion into the evening like a burden that grew teeth. He had already buried his, quietly, between 2 prayers and a mouthful of water. He never announced it. He didn't ring a bell or send out warnings. He just stopped. Sometimes leaning against a tent pole, sometimes curled beneath a tree, a general, a scholar, a man whose name could clear a room, and he was snoring softly beside a saddlebag. And yet no one dared disturb him, not because he was fierce, but because there was something sacred about it, like watching a lion close its eyes mid-hunt. You didn't ask questions. You didn't interrupt. You learned, if you were smart, to follow his lead. There's something strange about seeing a man who carries the weight of empires take a nap like it's the most natural thing in the world. It shakes your idea of leadership. You expect him to be tense, alert, always standing. But Saladin taught with posture, with breath, with eyelids that dared to close before victory. He knew the body was a tool, not an idol. It had limits, and the rest wasn't weakness. It was how you preserved the sharpness. How did you keep the blade from dulling in the sheath? The siesta wasn't about escaping. It was about returning. When he woke, his mind was clearer. His voice was steadier. His decisions landed with a quiet finality that didn't need to shout. People wondered how he managed to remain calm under pressure. They thought it might be divine favor. Perhaps it was destiny. But often, it was just the wisdom of a man who knew how to close his eyes at the right moment. He didn't need a bed, or silence, or privacy. He needed only a pause, and that was the secret. Not a grand tactic, just a nap, but the kind that resets your spine, your breath, your spirit, the kind that turns a weary man into a legend before the sun even sets. Horses, tents, and total serenity, battlefield bedtime stories. The siestas were quiet. Still almost ceremonial, but war is louder. And that's where the real surprise begins. Because even on the edge of chaos, when campfires flickered low and scouts returned with news that made lesser men lie awake and count regrets, Saladin slept. The tents were made of canvas stretched over wooden poles. The beds were rolled mats on uneven dirt, and the lullabies were murmured prayers carried on the wind between the clinks of armor and the coughing up of the desert. But none of it bothered him. The world stayed awake, so he didn't have to. He didn't toss, didn't fidget. He simply lay down next to a saddlebag or a bundled cloak, closed his eyes, and disappeared into rest like it had been waiting for him. Sometimes the horse was tied nearby. Sometimes it wasn't either way. The scent of leather, dust, and danger filled the air. And still he slept like a man with nothing to fear and nowhere better to be. It wasn't denial. He knew what waited at dawn: clashing steel, desperate cries. Lines of soldiers who had memorized his name before they ever saw his face. But that was the strange thing. He knew it and still rested. Not because he felt invincible, but because he understood something most people never do. Sleep doesn't wait for the right moment. It comes when you trust the ones around you. When your conscience doesn't tap your ribs every few minutes, asking what happens if you fail. His men watched him sleep and learned what courage really looked like. There were no command tents with heavy locks or guards pacing in tight circles. Just a flap, a candle, and the shape of their leader breathing slowly and steadily while the wind tugged at the edges of the canvas. And when he woke, he didn't stretch or complain. He rose with the kind of focus that makes a soldier grip his spear a little tighter. Because when a man can sleep that peacefully 1 hour before battle, you start to believe he's either blessed or something worse. And he never talked about it, never gave a speech on the power of naps or the wisdom of rest. He just lived it, led with it, taught men to keep their eyes sharp and their hearts calm by example. Even when the earth trembled under horses' hooves and the horizon shimmered with heat and dust and incoming arrows, Saladin had already found sleep the night before, not just because he needed it, because he knew others needed to see it. They say a good leader leads by action. He did, but also by stillness. He showed them what it meant to carry 1,000 lives and still sleep under stars that did not blink. Because when the sword is sharpened and the plan is set, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is close your eyes and trust the morning to come. And it always did. His personal sleep philosophy: why worrying is for the unwise, the battlefields came and went. Some ended in silence, others in stories that grew louder with each retelling. But whether the night followed bloodshed or a shaky truce, Saladin's sleep remained untouched. That was the part no one could understand. You could surround his tent with whispers, you could fill the camp with firelit rumors about what the Franks might do next, or whether the rations would last. He would nod, listen, thank the messenger, and then go to bed like the world wasn't holding its breath. He didn't carry things to bed, not the weight of decisions, not the pressure of being the man everyone watched. His cloak hit the mat, and his eyes followed. It wasn't detachment, it was intentional. He had a rule, though he never called it that. If it could not be fixed by moonlight, it could wait for sunrise. If the problem grew claws in the dark, he let it scratch at someone else's tent flap. He never answered fear on its own schedule. His commanders noticed. They whispered to each other while poking at the fire. One had seen Saladin fall asleep while they were still debating which route to take through the hills. Another had watched him doze off after writing a letter to a king who had once sworn to kill him. It wasn't arrogance. It was a belief, not in luck or diplomacy, but in the process, in balance, in doing what could be done and refusing to bleed over what could not. He didn't shout to be heard. He didn't pace the camp like a restless father watching his children sleep. He trusted his orders, trusted his scouts, trusted the rhythm of preparation. When it was time to act, he acted. When it was time to wait, he waited without grinding his teeth down to nothing. And when it was time to sleep, he did. Not because he didn't care, but because he cared enough to stay whole. People looked for secrets. They assumed he must drink something, meditate on special words, perhaps perform a ritual that no one else knows. But the truth was more straightforward. Saladin knew that worrying changes nothing but your heartbeat. It fogs your mind, it drains your voice, and it ruins your sleep. He refused to give it that power. So he breathed, he prayed, he lay down, and he didn't rise again until the stars faded. You could try to copy it, but it only works if you believe the way he did. That rest isn't a reward. It's a responsibility that staying up all night doesn't make you strong. It just makes you tired in places you won't feel until it's too late. Saladin never bragged about sleeping well. He just did it. Because the wise do not fear the dark. They greet it with silence, with peace, and sometimes with snoring that scares the horses a little. Taming the crescent moon, night watches, but not for him. He slept because he trusted. That much was clear. But trust in Saladin's world was not blind. It was trained, sharpened, assigned with a purpose. While others curled up with one eye open and a dagger under the blanket, Saladin handed his night to men who had earned it. The guards, the watchmen, the ones who stood in the wind while he lay still under the thin hum of the stars. And they didn't resent it. They watched more carefully because he had fallen asleep. That was the twist. His rest was not a burden on them. It was an honor, a wordless promotion from soldier to keeper of the moonlit silence. He never pretended to be invincible. He knew enemies could slip through shadows. He knew not every man who bowed by day remained loyal by night. But he also knew something most leaders forget. That being awake is not the same as being safe. You can stand guard over your own mind until sunrise and still lose yourself to fear. He had no interest in that. Saladin gave each hour its job. If it was not the hour for war or talk or letters scratched onto parchment by candlelight, then it belonged to sleep. And he would not steal it from himself out of pride. Others tried to mimic him. They watched how he dozed before sunrise battles. He yawned gently after receiving dire messages from distant outposts. However, the copy never quite landed the same because they missed the part underneath. That Saladin didn't rest to escape. He rested to endure, and more importantly, he didn't need to prove he was strong enough to stay up. He had already proven he was strong enough to lie down, even when the camp was tense, with the wind carrying strange noises and the scouts returning with tight eyes and quiet voices. He listened, nodded, adjusted the plan, and then slept anyway. He didn't pace. Didn't post himself dramatically at the edge of the fire like a martyr waiting to be praised. He ducked into his tent or leaned against a rock or curled under a borrowed wool cloak, and within minutes he was gone. Not because he didn't feel the tension, but because he had learned how to let the night do its job. Darkness did not scare him. It soothed him like a page, turning without warning, soft and inevitable. His commanders never forgot it. That image of him sleeping while they strained to control their nerves. It didn't make them question his dedication. It made them believe in his judgment even more fiercely. If he was calm enough to rest, then something must still be under control. They didn't just guard him. They guarded the quiet around him. They cleared space so he could breathe in peace. Because a rested Saladin was a dangerous Saladin. And everyone preferred to face the storm with him fully awake and freshly returned from wherever sleep had taken him. Clean conscience, clear pillow. How forgiveness helped him sleep. The men who guarded his sleep began to notice something else. It wasn't just that Saladin rested intensely, or that he trusted the night to carry its own weight. It was what he left behind before he closed his eyes. No grudges, no simmering fury, no unfinished arguments waiting to burn through the quiet. He forgave easily, not carelessly, not like someone who didn't feel insulted or injured, but like someone who had decided revenge was too heavy to take to bed. That confused people. They had seen leaders before who slept well because their enemies were dead. But Saladin forgave men who had tried to kill him. He returned to the cities without demanding trophies. He spared soldiers who would not have spared him. And then, after the scrolls were signed and the swords were lowered, he lay down and slept like it was the most natural thing in the world. Not because he forgot, but because he refused to let bitterness sharpen the edge of his peace. Forgiveness wasn't softness. It was a strategy. Quiet strategy. The kind that doesn't announce itself with banners or drums. It happened in private. At the end of long days, after councils, after conflict, after the kind of choices that age a man before the mirror, the truth tells. He forgave, and then he rested. Not because everything was perfect, but because he had done what he could with the daylight, and he would not let the night become a courtroom for things already decided. One of his scribes once said he wrote better after forgiveness, that his hands steadied. His thoughts came clearer. He didn't need to rewrite lines soaked in anger. He just said what needed to be said, rolled up the parchment, handed it off, and found his corner of the tent. The war might continue, the disputes might return, but the moment belonged to rest, and only rest. Even his enemies spoke of it. Not his tactics, his mercy, the way he held power with an open hand. He did not humiliate the defeated. He did not gloat. He looked them in the eye, made his decision, and walked away lighter. And if anyone wondered how he could stand at the edge of battle after battle, and still wake with clear eyes and steady breath, the answer was simple. He did not carry rage across the threshold of sleep. Sleep does not come easily to those who sharpen old wounds before bed. It does not comfort those who rehearse betrayal beneath their blankets. Saladin knew this. He had known it since the cold stone floors of his childhood castle, since the firelit camps outside trembling cities, since the long rides through silence with only his thoughts for company. If you wanted peace at night, you had to make peace before nightfall. That was the rule. Not carved in law, and just carved in the rhythm of a man who led with grace and woke without shadows. Hygiene before bed, no showers. Just rose water and sandalwood forgiveness cleared the mind. But clean skin helped too. Saladin understood that rest was not just a matter of breath or belief. It was a ritual, small choices stitched together to prepare the body for surrender. He didn't sleep like a soldier. He slept like someone who had made peace with dust and found a way to smell good anyway. There were no long baths, no steam rooms, no marble tubs filled with flower petals and philosophical conversation. What he had was water in a bowl, a cloth, and a slow method that made even the most chaotic days end in quiet. He didn't need luxury. He needed rhythm. His attendants knew when the day was done because the basin appeared. Rose water, if it could be spared, cool and sharp. A scent that didn't shout, just lingered. It was gently rubbed over his face, hands, and behind his ears, the kind of touch that told the skin it had survived. He didn't rush it. He moved like the day was being washed off one layer at a time. Sandalwood came next. Not slathered, dabbed, smoothed into the wrist, the neck, the collarbone, just enough to remind him he was human, and not a shadow carved out of dust and obligation. There was something almost sacred about it. no candles, no chants, but still holy in the way simple things become holy when done with attention. It didn't matter if he was in a stone chamber or a tent pitched on hard soil. The cloth still came. The water was still cool. The scent still marked the moment when leadership paused and rest was allowed to step in. He didn't carry dirt to bed. Not physical, not emotional. He cleaned what he could. The rest was left to God and morning. And yes, it startled people. They expected a man of war to sleep in his armor, jaw-clenched face, still streaked with the grime of marching. But Saladin did the opposite. He disarmed himself, quietly, deliberately, because he understood something most warriors missed. You cannot meet dreams smelling like blood and fear. You must enter sleep the way you wish to join the next day, fresh, grounded, empty of the things you are not meant to keep. He didn't say much while he cleaned. He spoke less, as if his voice had done enough already, as if the silence itself deserved to stretch out a little before the final breath of the night. And when he lay down, his skin cooled, his muscles softened, his scent whispered of gardens he had not walked in for years, but still remembered. This is what they didn't put in the history books, not the dates, or the treaties, or the victories, but the way a man wiped his face with rose water and laid his sword at the edge of sleep, like it was not a weapon, but a burden he could finally set down. And for one more night, he did. Zero luxury, maximum peace. The Sultan slept on the floor. You would think that after the rose water, the sandalwood, the careful ritual of wiping away dust and duty, Saladin would sink into something grand. A mattress piled high with embroidered cushions, a bed carved from cedar and polished by moonlight, silk sheets imported from the east. But no, what waited for him each night was the floor. A woven mat, a folded cloak, sometimes a pillow if one had not been handed to someone else first. His bed was flat, humble, and forgettable, and that was the point. He did not want the comfort that confused him. He did not want to be so high above the ground that he forgot where the ground was. He slept on the dirt on purpose, not to punish himself, but to remember where he came from, what he stood on, what his soldiers knelt on when they prayed before battle, what his enemies bled into when they fell. The earth was not beneath him, it was beside him. So he lay down and let it hold him. It unsettled his guests. Foreign dignitaries would peek into his quarters and look for the bed they were sure must be hidden behind some curtain. But all they saw was simplicity, a mat, a cloak, a man curled like a child, one hand tucked beneath his head, his sandals at the edge of the room. They would return to their chambers, restless on feather-stuffed cushions, unable to understand how a man who commanded nations chose to sleep like a traveller, with nothing but the stars for a ceiling. But it made sense to him. He had seen kings grow soft in silk, seen men refuse sleep unless it came with servants and gold-threaded blankets, and then he had watched them fall apart the first time they had to rest on a campaign trail or a wet hillside. He did not want that. His body needed to know the floor. His soul needed to stay low enough to hear when the people cried. How fasting cleared his mind and sharpened his sleep the night before the battle, taught them how still he could be under pressure. But it was the days without food that revealed something more profound. During Ramadan or voluntary fasts, when the body shrinks inward and the mouth stays quiet from dawn to dusk, most men grow sharp-edged, irritable. Sleep came harder when the stomach echoed with absence. But Saladin seemed to float through those days with a kind of softness that unnerved the ones around him, as if emptiness made him lighter, as if hunger cleared the smoke from his thoughts. He would fast and still ride, still speak, still listen, and when the sun dipped low and the dates were passed around, he would take just enough to greet the evening, then retreat with the same calm as always. But his sleep was different during those nights, deeper. Not because he was exhausted, because he was clean inside and out. The quiet was thicker somehow. The dreams are more vivid, the rest is more final, like a stone settling at the bottom of a well. He never made a show of it. There was no dramatic collapse, no public act of devotion to prove how pious or tired he was. He did what he always did. He folded his cloak, he lay down on the mat, and he let sleep take him. The hunger didn't chase him there. It stepped aside, almost respectfully. He understood that this man wasn't weakened by it. He was sharpened. Some said he slept better on an empty stomach, so that his breath came more easily. That his eyes were clearer when he woke. Maybe it was discipline. Perhaps it was something older. A trust that when the body was emptied, the soul had more room to breathe. He didn't speak of it, but it showed in the way he carried himself. No twitch, no tension, just clarity. A man who had trimmed everything down to the essentials and discovered peace in the space left behind. There were nights when others groaned and shifted, stomachs restless, sleep refusing to settle on their tired bones. And from the next tent came silence. Not just the absence of noise, the presence of peace. Saladin asleep. Again, not despite the hunger, but because of what it made him release. He didn't need to fill every gap. He didn't fear the hollow hours. He knew the body was a guest house, and fasting was just another way to sweep the floor before lying down. It taught his men something new. That sleep doesn't always come from fullness. Sometimes it waits behind restraint. It arrives not when you've taken all you can, but when you've let go of everything you don't need. And in those nights of saltless bread and whispered prayers, Saladin slept like a man who had already feasted, not with his mouth, with his mind, and the earth cradled him like always. Mat beneath, peace above, hunger outside, and silence within. No wine, no women, no problem. Why his focus let him sleep deep the fasting, cleared the clutter, emptied the body, without weakening the mind. But it was the things Saladin never allowed in that made his sleep feel weightless. He refused wine, not just publicly, not just when scribes were near, quietly, consistently, while other leaders drank themselves soft before bed or chased sleep with goblets full of forgetfulness. Saladin stayed clear. No haze, no fog. He wanted his dreams to mean something, not dissolve the second the sun touched the tent. And then there was temptation, the kind that comes wrapped in silk and sweetened with distraction. He had seen it ruin men faster than war ever could. Wives in one city, lovers in another, and a trail of broken promises wherever they rode. Saladin kept his life simple. He didn't collect women like prizes, didn't build his nights around a company he couldn't trust in the morning, while others burned through passion and then lay awake listening for footsteps that weren't friendly. Saladin was asleep before they finished doubting themselves, because peace doesn't sleep in a room where desire whispers too loudly. He didn't judge, he didn't preach, he just stayed focused. It wasn't about being above pleasure. It was about choosing peace over chaos. He had no interest in building a house of comfort if it meant the foundation cracked every time temptation knocked. His bed was his own, unshared, unbothered. He lay down with a clean mind and a clear heart. That was enough. Some found it strange. How could he live in a world that offered everything and still choose restraint? They thought it was unnatural, lonely even. But he didn't look lonely. Not when he sat by the fire with a quiet smile. Not when he pressed his forehead to the ground in prayer. Not when he curled into sleep like someone returning home, not escaping it. His solitude wasn't empty. It was curated, tended like a garden. He refused to let weeds grow in. And that's what made his sleep so steady. He wasn't being chased. Not by guilt, not by secrets, not by the fading perfume of a night he wished he could forget. He slept without rewriting his memory in the dark. He didn't flinch when dreams arrived. He welcomed them, even the strange ones, even the ones that came heavy with meaning, because he knew he hadn't fed them poison. They weren't twisted by regret. That's what the others never saw, the quiet sacrifice behind his rest. He didn't surrender to temptation just because it knocked politely. He didn't drink the things that made the world blur so he could pretend it was soft. He lived in sharp focus, and because of that, his sleep was pure. No stumbling into it, no drowning in it. Just a soft descent into silence earned by choosing clarity again and again. A sleep that held no shame, just stillness, just the truth, and the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to hide from the dark, the pillow of prayer. How his faith was a sleeping aid. He slept alone. He slept sober, but never without prayer. That was the last sound in his tent most nights. Not the creak of tired joints or the sigh of exhaustion, just a quiet voice speaking to something beyond the canvas and the stars. There was no performance in it, no raised hands to impress, no long-winded declarations, just stillness, a whisper, a pause, and then silence. Like the soul had just been kissed on the forehead and told it was safe to rest. It wasn't a chore, it wasn't a checklist. It was a release, a handing over, one final gesture before letting sleep arrive unchallenged. He didn't ask for comfort. He asked for clarity. He didn't beg for victory. He asked for wisdom. And then, with nothing left to hold, he lowered himself to the mat like a stone slipping beneath the surface of a calm lake. The prayer was not the beginning of his rest. It was the rest itself. It cleared the corners of his mind, washed out the day's dust, and made space for silence. And when it was done, his body followed as if pulled gently by something invisible and kind. People often talk about peace as if it were a reward, something earned after effort. Saladin carried it with him like a tool. He used it, built with it, sharpened it against noise. But it only stayed sharp because of that final conversation he had before sleep. A conversation that asked nothing of the world and everything of himself. Forgiveness for what he missed, gratitude for what he saw, surrender for what he couldn't change. There was no theatre in it. Just a man talking to the sky, a glance upward, a name whispered into the dark, and then sleep arrived like an obedient servant. Other nights took longer, not because he was worried, but because he had more to say, not to people, not to generals, to the one he believed watched the tent while he slept beneath it. And he thought it fully, that someone else was in charge once he closed his eyes. That rest was not abandonment, it was trust. His men noticed it. They tried it themselves, some with full hearts, others have doubts. But many returned saying the same thing. It helped, not the words, the act, the turning over, the choice not to carry everything into sleep like a bundle of knives. Saladin never told them what to say. He just showed them that even a leader with enemies, weight, and history still knelt before sleep, still admitted limits, still needed something larger than his own voice to silence the noise. He didn't need a pillow. His mat was hard. His tent was plain. But prayer softened everything. It made the ground feel less like stone. It made his breath come slower. It made the night feel held, not by fabric, not by guards, but by something eternal. And so he slept again. And again, safely, fluidly, and faithfully. Letters, maps, and then lights out. His actual bedtime routine prayer came last. But before that there was a rhythm, not grand, not ceremonial, just small motions that stitched the day closed like a seam. He read, he wrote. He reviewed maps with a steady hand and a face that showed no rush. He never let urgency bleed into the final hour. Even if the news was heavy, the scrolls unopened, the ink still wet from a rider's frantic journey, he handled it all the same way, seated, still, deliberate. His desk was a plank balanced between stones. His lamp was no brighter than necessary. But those quiet few moments before sleep were always claimed, no matter what waited outside the flap of the tent. The letters were not long. He didn't believe in drowning thoughts in flourishes. He read reports, answered what needed answering, and left the rest for daylight. No one ever caught him scribbling in the dark or chasing words into midnight. He wrote like someone who knew the edge of sleep was coming and chose not to outrun it. The quill went down exactly when it was supposed to. No delay. He didn't cling to the day as if it owed him something. Then came the maps, the terrain, the paths. He would unfold them carefully, smooth them flat, and study the curves of land the same way someone else might trace a loved one's face. Not with anxiety, with respect. He didn't memorize every route. He memorized the patterns. He knew the feel of a valley, the distance between breath and ambush, but when he finished, he didn't linger. He folded the map the same way he had folded his thoughts. Tight, neat, closed. No need to sleep beside what had already been understood. Sometimes he would call for a scribe. Other times he spoke to no one. Just himself, quietly, a few lines into the air. Not out of loneliness, but out of habit. Words that didn't need remembering, only releasing. He didn't believe everything had to be preserved. Some thoughts were meant to be said once and then given to the night. He drank water, only a little. Just enough to rinse away the last drop. He didn't eat, not that late. He didn't pace, didn't stretch, didn't adjust his space like someone preparing a stage. His bed was already waiting. The mat didn't change. The cloak was folded. The lamp was dim. That was enough. And then the last motion, the final breath, a nod to the lamp, a whisper, a prayer, the soft pull of wool over his shoulder. The silence fell in layers. It never dragged. It never stalled. His eyes closed like pages turning themselves. One more day was placed gently on the shelf of memory. One more night untouched by the weight he carried. His sleep was not an escape. It was a rhythm, a routine, and he followed it until the breath slowed and the room forgot to wait for him. He was already gone, dreaming on a mat while the world remained outside. Post-battle slumber. He slept even better after mercy. He maintained his routine regardless of the circumstances, whether it was the quiet of a regular night or the edge of war pressing in like a breath held too long. But something changed after a battle, not in the way he walked, not in the way he spoke, in the way he slept. It was deeper, thicker, like sleep itself bowed its head and gave him something extra. Not for victory, for mercy, because Saladin never celebrated a win the way most did. He didn't throw feasts. He didn't raise his voice. He stood on the field, looked at the wounded, the surrendered, the mess that power always leaves behind, and chose something quieter. He spared people. He returned the hostages. He sent water to the thirsty and protection to the defeated. And that night, after all of it, he slept as if the earth had thanked him. His attendants would speak of those nights in hushed tones, how he came back not lighter, but more at ease. There was no boast in his eyes, no burn in his shoulders. He removed his cloak slowly. He sat by the water basin a little longer, and when he finally lay down, there was no delay. His body folded like paper, his breath settled like dust, and within minutes he was lost in it. No tossing, no restless twitch beneath the wool. Just stillness, like a lake after rain. They say that the body remembers what the soul chooses, and Saladin's body always remembered mercy. Even if the day had been loud with swords and cracked with shouts, even if the air had stung of blood and horse sweat and shattered pride, he found rest easier when he had chosen compassion. It was a strange lesson that the more challenging path, the one with restraint instead of vengeance, was the one that led to deeper sleep. But he had learned it young, and he practiced it like a habit he couldn't break. The men who rode with him often struggled after battles. Some blinked at the ceiling all night, some flinched in their dreams, some drank until silence came, but he needed none of that. He needed only to know he had not crossed the line between strength and cruelty, that he had done what needed doing and nothing more then, and only then would the sleep come heavy and healing, the kind that stitched him back together without asking questions. One evening, after sparing a garrison that had sworn to fight him to the last man, he was seen resting with one hand under his cheek and a half-smile flickering just at the corner of his mouth. Not triumph, not relief, just peace. Earned the hard way, the quiet kind that shows up after you've chosen humanity over conquest. And it stayed with him through the cold, through the wounds. Through the years, sleep never left him when he led with mercy. It came faithfully, like a friend who knew exactly when to arrive and how to hold him. The night he died, calm, quiet, and full of peace. The last night did not arrive with a storm. It came softly, the kind of quiet that does not ask permission, only enters and sits beside you. Saladin had grown thinner. His hands were still steady, but slower. The mat hadn't changed. The cloak was the same. The lamp burned low and flickered, as if it knew something was amiss. He had not led a charge that day, had not read maps or summoned scribes. He had simply sat, spoke a few words, smiled when someone brought dates, though he barely touched them, and as the evening drew near, he asked only for water. Then silence. There were no dramatics, no gasping or declarations. He did not try to rise or hold on to anything. He lay down the same way he always had, as if sleep was waiting in the same place it always lived, just under the surface. Just behind the breath, the men in the next room waited, but not out of fear. There was no fear in the air, only stillness, not hollow. Some say he whispered something before his eyes closed. A name, a prayer. No one heard it. Others say he said nothing at all, just one long exhale, not forced, not labored, just final. The kind of breath you release only when you are sure you have emptied your hands of every duty and left nothing undone. He left without gold, without a sword. A robe was folded neatly at the corner of the room. He had given most of it away long before that final night. His wealth lived in other places, in broken cities made whole again, in families spared. The enemies turned quiet with respect, in the way his men spoke his name with lowered voices and eyes that always looked past the horizon when they said it. And when dawn came, he was still covered with a thin sheet, face turned slightly toward the window where the first light always entered. The lamp had gone out on its own, not suddenly, gently, as if it knew. They say his sleep that night looked no different than the hundreds before it. No strain, no tension, just a man lying on a mat, one hand beneath his cheek, the other resting over his chest, as if he might wake at any moment and ask for a basin and a scroll. But he didn't. He had gone farther than any letter could reach. That was the end. Not loud, not lonely, just quiet, just whole. A man who had slept through battles, across deserts, inside tents, beside enemies and beneath stars, had finally gone to sleep without needing to rise again. And even death, it seemed, had the decency not to wake him. You're still awake, he's still asleep. Maybe that's the lesson. He left the world without a struggle, no fire in the lungs, no clawing for breath. Just that final soft release, like a sigh folded into silence. And somehow, all these years later, he's still asleep. Not just in the grave in the memory. In the way his name lives, calm, unbothered, unmoved by all the noise that came after him, while you toss on a mattress built with science and stitched by machines, Saladin still rests on a mat made of nothing but habit and surrender. And maybe that's what stings. You're here, blinking at the ceiling, full of questions. He's there, far away, and full of nothing, because he gave it all back before he lay down. You keep checking your phone. He kept checking his soul. You pace the hallway rehearsing arguments with people who won't remember what they said. He sat in a corner, whispered to the sky, and let the day end. You clutch sleep like it owes you something. He offered it his whole life and let it return to him freely. You scroll. He prayed. You stir. He stilled. You blame the world. He trusted it would turn without his help. You try lavender oil and meditation apps, as well as ocean sounds piped through tiny speakers. He tried humility. He tried restraint. He tried saying less, wanting less, taking less. And now you wonder why your pillow still holds your anxiety like a sponge, while his was just a folded cloak and the weight of nothing. That's the twist no one likes. That sleep was not something he found. It was something he protected. He guarded it like land, not by force, but by living in a way that didn't invite ghosts into the night. He didn't confuse exhaustion with accomplishment. He didn't run himself into the ground so he could brag about how broken he felt. He slowed before the day ended. He forgave before the lamp went out. He washed his hands. He closed his eyes. He stopped, and here you are, awake, wrapped in soft things that do not comfort you, thinking of what could go wrong tomorrow, or what did go wrong 10 years ago, or why someone still hasn't answered your message. And all the while, a man who once carried the weight of cities, of kingdoms, of crusades and betrayals and battlefields, is asleep in the dust of memory, still calm, still unshaken, still resting beneath a world that never gave him peace in daylight, but always gave him peace by night. So maybe it isn't about what you own, or what you build, or how loudly you speak. Perhaps it's about what you let go of before you close your eyes. Maybe it's about learning to lie down without clinging to everything you stood for that day. Perhaps you're still awake because you haven't yet forgiven what he forgave before dinner. And maybe, just maybe, that's the only thing between you and the kind of sleep that does not flinch, the kind he mastered, the kind that stays. So now you know it wasn't the mat. It wasn't the rosewater. It wasn't some ancient secret, whispered by monks under moonlight. Saladin slept because he lived like a man who didn't need to fight at night. He didn't chase peace. He prepared for it with restraint, with forgiveness. With a clear mind and a quiet room, he stripped down his life until nothing was left to rattle in his dreams. No grudges, no guilt, no hunger for more than what was already given, just enough. Always just enough. And while the world spun and trembled and carved monuments in his name, Saladin lay still, intense, on stone. Besides battles, inside memory, he slept when others couldn't, because he had already made peace with what most people run from. He knew the war was never really in the field. It was always in the heart. And he won that one long before history wrote him down. So now, as you lay your head on a pillow he never needed, maybe you breathe a little slower. You may let go of one thing, just one. And, in that space, sleep comes to you too. Not because you chased it, but because you made room. Good night, and rest well.